Thank you for joining us. My name is Brian Elaine. I'm here today with Dr. Lerita Coleman Brown. Lerita is the author of a new book titled What Makes You Come Alive? A Spiritual Walk with Howard Thurman, published by Broadleaf Books. Lerita is a retreat leader, speaker, spiritual companion, and professor emerita of psychology at Agnes Scott College. With a BA from the University of California, Santa Cruz, PhD from Harvard, and a certificate from Shalom Institute for Spiritual Formation, Lerita frequently speaks on contemplative spirituality and Howard Thurman. She is the author of numerous articles, essays, and an edited volume, and also the book When the Heart Speaks, Listen, Discovering Inner Wisdom. She has been featured in PBS documentaries about Howard Thurman and the Black Church. She lives in Stone Mountain, Georgia. You can learn more about Lerita and all of her work at LeritaColemanBrown.com. So Lerita, thanks so much for joining us, and congratulations on all of your wonderful work.
Well, thank you. I'm just so excited to be here, and I'm excited to talk about this book and to talk with you because I just really appreciate all the work that you've done to encourage and affirm new, writers of all kinds, but especially, the writers of color. So thank
Well,
you.
thank you. As we were talking beforehand, we both have found second careers, I guess, if you would call it, kind of in our older life. Whatever.
The third chapter or
Third
whatever it
chapter.
is,
Yeah, there you
act.
go. Yeah. So we've been both, I think, very fortunate, to be able to do, lots of great things, while we can.
Yes, absolutely.
So maybe to start off, is there anything else that you'd like to tell people about besides what I kind of briefly highlighted on?
Well, I think I've been a spiritual seeker, I think, from the time I was a child, but I had no vocabulary to describe it as that. But I certainly was one who was drawn to nature like Howard Thurman was as a young child. And when I discovered him, I found that there were so many people who had not ever heard of him.
Mm-hmm.
And I really wanted to write something for spiritual seekers like myself, or people who go to retreats and conferences, so that they could incorporate some of his wisdom into their daily lives. So I'm just delighted that I have this opportunity.
So before we get into the new book, can you tell people a little bit about the previous things you've written?
Yes, well, I've written a number of essays and books about understanding how important spirituality is to breaking down divides.
Mm.
That there's something about working on your own spiritual life and having one that I think is really important to then beginning to have a sort of more expansive consciousness and a sense that you are, connected to, everybody and everything. And so I that's been one of my um, my one of my ideas that I felt as I was leaving the academy that I wanted to work on, that somehow or other, of course, in the academy, there's not a lot of spirituality going on unless it's in the seminary or the seminary part. But that, spiritual life was just really important. And then in my earlier book, my book about When the Heart Speaks, it was really my attempt to dampen down the terror that I experienced when I had to go through a heart transplant 28 years ago. And one of the ways that I did that was write myself through.
Wow.
And I had a wonderful therapist at the time who had suggested that, because I said, I don't know what I want to do. And he said, well, you don't have to make a decision. Why don't you go talk to your heart though first? And so I thought, what? Talk to my heart. And I thought, oh, I'm from California, but this was a little too much psychobabble for me, right? So, but I did go thinking I was going to have a conversation. And it ended up that I was started to have these weekly conversations with my old and new hearts.
Hmm.
Uh, and so my, old heart is just hysterical but prepared me for letting it go when it came time for me to have the transplant. So it was probably over the course of 3 or 4 months that I wrote these conversations.
Hmm.
And then I received a new heart. And I had a sort of a different kind of story set up until I was able to meet my donor's family, particularly my
Wow.
brother, who allowed me to tell her real story, which was one of a person who was concerned about her health in her 40s because her mother had died of a brain tumor when she was age 43.
Hmm.
And so just around her 40th birthday, she had a brain aneurysm.
Hmm.
And it became clear that she was not going to come back from that after a major stroke after that. So her family chose to donate many, basically all the basic organs, including some cornea, because her father was an optician.
Hmm.
Yeah, so it's quite the story. And I'm so grateful that I had, again, an opportunity to share with an audience about what's in your heart. What are you carrying around with you? And what are some of the things that you, if your heart were leaving, it would need to pack up and take with it. So I enjoyed writing that book, although it took me a long time to get it published. I had written it initially shortly after my transplant, but at the time, which was the sort of late 90s, publishers were not interested in talking hearts. So, I had an agent, they were like, look, we can't sell this, sorry. And that was that. So I put it in the file drawer and then pulled it out the file drawer after I left the academy and started working on it again. It was, I was just persistent in because I felt like it needed to be out there.
Well, good for you. I mean, and I can't tell you how many people that I've heard, similar stories from the standpoint of when they started working on something, to when it actually got published, many times years in between.
Yes. Yes.
It's a long haul. It's a journey of persistence, I think, is,
That and timing is everything. And
Yeah.
so clearly that was not the right time, but the time became, available for me to do that. And I think it's still very helpful for people that are having any kind of cardiac issues or medical issues in general, to read, because it's really informative about what you might want to be doing and thinking in your life right now to feel more whole and more happy.
Mm-hmm. And I think, the publishing industry and the world at large are much more open to books from writers of color now
Yes.
than they used to be.
Yes.
And so, back to your point about timing, I think it's changed dramatically for a lot of folks.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
So 28 years since you had a heart transplant. I mean, that seemed to me like a long time.
It is.
Is that typical?
And I've had a kidney transplant in between.
Wow.
The heart transplant. I had a bad rejection episode and they told me they were going to be able to save my heart, but we are going to have to kill my kidneys to do it.
Oh my goodness.
So I spent a year on dialysis and then one of my coworkers donated me a kidney.
Wow.
And it doesn't really end there, but I've had a valve replacement, it's just, I have a pacemaker. But I think, having a deep and abiding spirituality and a spiritual life really helps you get through these things that you're like thinking, what? Right? So yeah.
Good for you. My goodness. I mean, you look healthy and alive now. So I mean, praise God for, that.
Well, I always say, with God and good makeup, you can go.
Oh, I should try that, I guess.
They do it on television,
So let's get to your new book. As I mentioned, the title is What Makes You Come Alive? A Spiritual Walk with Howard Thurman. So what motivated you to write that book?
Well, in some ways it was a series of, I don't know, you want to call it divine intervention or, sacred synchronicities. I discovered Howard Thurman later in life, and which I found kind of appalling since, I had been reading spiritual books for years and attending conferences, attending churches, etc., and never heard his name. And as I was finishing up my spiritual direction companion program at the Shalem Institute, I needed a final project. And so I kept thinking, in the history of the world, has there not been an African or African mystic? Like, what? So I started, asking around, and a clergy friend of mine said, oh, you haven't heard of Howard Thurman? And I'm like, no. And so he introduced me to Howard Thurman. I was like, oh my God, look at this. This man had already published, 20 books, you know. And so I did my final project on Howard Thurman. And so maybe about a year or so after that, I started leading retreats at the, request of Carl McColman, who
Oh, cool.
much into
Yes.
studying the mystics. And so he's, you need to start giving retreats on Howard Thurman. So I said, okay. So he recommended me to Ignatius House here in Atlanta. And that was my very first retreat in 2016. And I just continued to do those, give the talks, particularly on one of his classic books, Jesus and the Disinherited. And then I went to the Wild Goose Festival in 2017.
Sure.
And as I was walking in with a friend, a woman by the name of Beck Cranford came up to us in a golf cart and said, hey, you want to ride? And we're like, we'll just walk. And then she asked us what we were doing. And I said, well, I'm giving a talk on Howard Thurman. And so she said, really? She says, well, wait right there. And she drives into the campground, comes back and hands me a painting, an icon style painting of Howard Thurman, and says, here, this is for you.
Whoa.
Yes.
Where did that come from?
That was my response was, what? So I'm like, okay. And so I carried that around. I brought it home and sat it in my foyer, and I looked at it, and the eyes on it looked like, Howard Thurman's just following you as you go. Like, okay, what are you doing? What are you doing? Because I think in some ways, he's been the darling of a lot of seminaries and schools of theology, but everyday people don't know about him.
Yeah.
So, and I think that was part of what he wanted, was for, normal everyday people to utilize his wisdom. So I guess I still kept looking at it, but I started sort of thinking about what aspects of his life might be useful for a spiritual seeker. And had lunch one day with Luther Smith, and he kept saying, so who's your audience? Who's your audience? And I kept saying, spiritual seekers, like regular everyday people. So then out of the blue, which is usually a sign from the spirit, I get contacted by an acquisitions editor at Broadleaf Press who says, hey, are you working on anything? I'm like, well, maybe. I don't know. I've been thinking about writing this book on Howard Thurman. And she said, well, let's draw up a proposal. Maybe, we might have something here. So, and that was the beginning of the pandemic. So as they say, the rest is the future.
Well, at least you had more time to write, probably.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it was sort of like, so what are you doing, Lerita? I mean, it's like you had the perfect conditions. Yeah. And these serendipities kept happening. I mean, I kept getting, the volumes, the Howard Thurman Papers Project, all 5 volumes got published. Somebody called me and asked me to be in a Howard Thurman documentary out of the blue. I mean, it's just like there were all these things that were just coming together. And so there I was, and there, I was off to the races. It's a lot of work. Even if it is a pandemic, it's still a lot of work. But as a transplant recipient, where was I going?
Really?
For real.
Well, some of the authors I worked with actually had a hard time writing during the pandemic. And then others, found it to be wonderful from the standpoint that, gave them more time.
Yeah.
So it really depended. It was a person-to-person kind of a thing.
Well, I just kept getting gifts. I mean, Walter Fluker, an eminent Thurman scholar, decided to have a class online because people weren't meeting in the classroom. So I could take a class and not leave my house. And Peter Eisenstadt, published a 400-page historical biography. I mean, just things just kept falling in my lap, and I just couldn't ignore that. So I had, in a weird way, started collecting books about Howard Thurman or by Howard Thurman shortly after I found out about him. I thought, there's some good stuff out here. And so every time I would find one, cheap on some, marketplace or someplace, I would just pick it up and just add it. And so then all of a sudden I had a library. So I basically had everything I needed And I felt this urging and calling from the Spirit, to write this book. You need to write this book. You have no excuses.
Well, good for Broadleaf for reaching out to you. I mean, they've been doing an excellent job over the last few years, I think, in terms of the books that they've been publishing. And, this is another example of that.
Yeah. Well, and I think this particular press really wants to have people that can kind of translate some heady academic stuff into ways that everyday people can utilize it.
Yes.
And so they're really using some of us. I mean, I'm not even in theology. My, background is in psychology, but I was able to read the text and I could read Thurman and understand most of it, right? There are times when he's way over my head, but I love that part of it, to be able to put it in words that were accessible to people, and for them to then be able to see how they could incorporate that in their.
So you mentioned, some of the other scholars, kind of in this area, Walter Fluker and Luther Smith. And there have been, several books now published about Howard Thurman. How does yours differ from them?
Well, a lot of the books that have been published on Howard Thurman are really published for an academic audience. That is, these are scholars who are evaluating and assessing his work in terms of whether they're theological terms or in some cases spiritual terms, but at that academic level. And, publishing these papers and books are part of the canons of, academia. But there isn't that space in there for to write something that's accessible to people. You know what I mean? Everyday spiritual seekers. And I understand that, having been in the academy for 33 years. If you write a book for a mass audience, it really doesn't count to them. They want something that they consider to be more scholarly. So my book is not written to be scholarly. It's truly written to address the spiritual hunger, as Thurman described it. I call it sort of starvation, because I was out there doing retreats and people are just starving spiritually. A lot of people are not getting that at church. And of course, since we've had the disruption of the pandemic, some people aren't going to church. But I tell people that, with spirituality, you don't have to wait till Sunday practice, right? You can do that every day. So my book is different in that way. It's not a scholarly book. It's a book for, as I said, the spiritual seeker who is trying to work on their spiritual life, expanded maybe in some ways, and, make some progress, make some shifts, do some healing. All of that is there.
So why do you think that Howard Thurman's work was so meaningful then and also still so meaningful now?
Well, I think that whatever kind of wisdom he was blessed with is timeless. So it doesn't really matter. Sometimes there are, like we say, classic books or people who, whatever they're saying just transcends time. And, it's so remarkable when you start to think about the fact that it transcends time. It's like there's a certain level of truth in it that it doesn't matter whether it's, 393, CE, or whether it's, 2100 or whatever, right? It's still true. And so the kinds of things that he talks about, whether it's about the healing power of silence or the stillness in nature and that connection to God, or how mysticism should lead you to out of your house into making social changes, or his notions of inner authority. All of those things are notions that no matter when you talk about them, they're still true and they're still relevant.
I mean, to me, that's incredibly impressive when there are authors that are like that, because they're really getting down to the fundamentals, not the transitory kinds of things. And if their work survives the decades, in that context, that really says a lot.
Well, and he was quite challenged by one of his seminary professors who knew that he was brilliant. Thurman was just brilliant. He was gifted. He was brilliant. And I think he was born a mystic, right? So he was walking around having these transcendent experiences when he was a child.
Wow.
And some people are born, I think I was born a contemplative. I'm not in the category of Thurman at all. I've had some mystical experiences, but I'm not, certainly there. But I call him an extraordinary mystic. And I might be an everyday sometimes. So he was challenged by his professor, George Cross, who basically said, look, I think that racial issues are important, but you, Thurman, just have the brilliance to deal with the sort of timeless hunger of the human spirit. I hope that you will direct your attention there. And Thurman was kind of like, okay, but do you understand what life is like for me inside this body, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So I think he chose to work on them both at the same time. And so you get this intersection of trying to find ways to help the disinherited or the dispossessed find inner freedom, which he believed was in God and their connection to God, while at the same time trying to help all of us remember or awaken to our oneness. So whichever way you want to go, he's working on trying to restore us to trying to help restore God's beloved creation. So he included the environment. And I think in these days and times, he would probably be considered an environmentalist. That we've forgotten our connection to that, but that we are connected to everything.
So I'd like to read from a couple of the endorsements for the book. This one is from Luther Smith, professor emeritus at Candler School of Theology, who will be speaking at our writers' conference next week. He says, this book is the most extensive portrayal of Howard Thurman's influence upon a spiritual seeker. Those are great words. How do you think you achieved that?
Wow. Well, and those are great words from Luther Smith, because he really was the one who wrote and published probably one of the first biography, I won't call it a biography, but an analysis of Thurman. I think it was really his dissertation that then got later published. And, he had these, he interviewed Thurman, interviewed the family. It's just an extraordinary book that he wrote, Howard Thurman, Mystic as Prophet. And so, but I think that he felt like there needed to be something out there that extended Thurman's dream and desire that every single person awaken to their spirit and their connection to the eternal. And so, and I think he also speaks to the point of, as I've said before, most books about Thurman aren't really accessible. And nor do they choose topics that are relevant to everyday life. So, the particular chapters that I chose related to that, but I also feel like I was listening to the Spirit. So it wasn't just me, right? I just had a friend text me and say, oh, this book is brilliant. And I was like, wait, I said, I didn't write this book by myself. Okay. I know I had inspiration, but I also had a good editor. Press as well, right?
Good.
And so I sort of feel like, we wrote the book, but I think a lot of it had to do with my listening for what it was that I needed to focus on.
Wow.
And to have an editor come through and say, well, that's fine, but no, or that's fine and expand this, or I think you should save this for some other, publication that you might, but it's not really. My editor cut 10,000 words, which is about 20 pages, right? And for a writer who's, we're sweating out every word.
Yeah.
I was like, oh my God. But I also understood that every year, I've got beautiful flowers and trees in my yard. You got to prune. So if you're going to get beauty, you're going to have to do some pruning. So I just, as I told my husband one day, I said, well, I'm going to have to check my ego at the door today because otherwise, it would be, it's kind of crushing, but I understood that was for the best.
Yeah. And I mean, and good editors are like,
oh,
the best thing that can happen to a book. I mean, for any author. I mean,
yes. And my editor, Valerie Weavers-Lurcher at
yes, she's excellent.
I know she's a wonderful person, and she can gently tell you this is crap.
Well, she's worked with, many authors that I've dealt with, and, to create wonderful, wonderful books. So,
oh yeah.
there's a lot of
thankful. I was
a lot of testimony out there to her skills, and just in the results.
Yeah.
So here's another quote. This was from Walter Fluker, editor and director of the Howard Thurmans Papers Project. He says, this wonderful distillation of Howard Thurman's profound wisdom includes questions and guides at the end of each chapter that invite readers into their own creative encounter with the truth, mystery, and love of God. I highly recommend it. So can you tell us a little bit about the questions and guides that you've included for each chapter?
So one of the things I learned in leading retreats on Howard Thurman is that people liked the contemplative nature of them, but they also wanted to be, they needed something provocative. They needed to chew on something and to reflect on something. So every time I led a retreat, I would have time for people to sit in groups, because Thurman really felt like that's where change really happened. And so he wanted people who normally don't talk to each other to talk to each other. So I would always create a set of reflection questions and ask people to find 2 or 3 other people they have never seen in life and to sit with them. I said,
really?
It's going to be uncomfortable, but you need to do this, right? So a lot of the reflection questions came out of those retreats that I led. Because I think that when we read and we don't stop to sort of reflect on what we've read, it's just sort of just, it just kind of like blends in, right? And the next week you probably have forgotten what you read. So, but when you have questions to think about, and how is this working in my life, et cetera, then I think it has a deeper, moves you in a deeper way. And then the steps, I think, was probably was a suggestion from Valerie, which is that, okay, so what are some things that they can actually put into action? Right? So not just, okay, you can sit around and reflect, but what can you do to improve?
I love that.
Life? And then we also gave towards the, at the end, lots of recommended readings, because what I wanted was, so say for instance, you're a nature person. Well, here's all the other things that you can read about that Thurman has written on nature. Or, maybe you're into mysticism. Okay, so here's his work on mysticism. So I wanted it to be a place where people also had resources to follow up on.
Wow, that's powerful. So I was intrigued by one of the chapters in the book that's titled "Our Minds Seethe with Endless Traffic." What's that all about?
Well, actually, that's a quote from one of Thurman's famous meditations called "How Good to Center Down." And one of the lines in that meditation is, it's really difficult to center down and be quiet enough to hear or to experience the presence of God. because
Mm.
our minds seethe with endless traffic. It's such a beautiful metaphor, doesn't it? I mean,
Yes.
we've all been in traffic.
Yes, exactly.
We know what it's like to, just one car after another, and they're just lined up, and because that's what happens. And I don't know if you sit, or not, but anybody who has a discipline of sitting or trying to quiet their mind, it's really tough.
I'm no good at it. I've tried, and I don't know. I'm not. I different skill set than I have.
Well, I tell people, because people will typically say to me, especially in Spiritual Companion, they will say, well, I just can't do that. My mind wanders. I said, that's what minds do.
Yeah.
I said, so it's about discipline and just about faithfulness, right?
Mm-hmm.
So maybe you don't have a good sit, but I think you should start, with 2 minutes or 3 minutes and work yourself up. Because out of the day, how much time do you really give to God is the question, right? So, and I think about it more like having a conversation, that prayer is really not a monologue where you give your to-do list to God, right? That there's some give and take in all relationships. And so it's so important for you to then sit and listen for what God may be asking of you. And oftentimes what I tell people is that just the mere sitting and trying to quiet all the distractions before the day gets started, pretty much. You may not hear guidance right then, but it might be later on in the afternoon when you're chopping celery in the kitchen. Because what's happened is that you have created just enough space for the spirit to get through in that city, right? So in the so if we're back in the traffic, there's enough space for you to move over to another lane, right? So just enough space so that then perhaps later on you will hear the guidance that the spirit is trying to send you.
Mm-hmm.
But if you don't, then there's just always
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, personally, I find that God speaks to me through other people so much more than through anything I can do myself. And that's been, as we were talking before, because I get to interact with so many incredible, gifted people who are really bright and really have a lot of ideas in different directions of their experience than what I have. That's where, so many different ideas have come to me. And I think that it's, God speaking through them to get me to do something.
Well, and that may be the way for you. And I tell people too that silence is not for everybody. Particularly if you've been through trauma or you've had a recent loss or something, it might not be good, because when you sit down like that, not only does the presence, you may sense the presence, but everything else, all the wounds and, may come up. So, but that, maybe for you it's walking, or, it might be listening to music, or, it's just a variety of ways. And Thurman was particularly interested in how can you spark? He didn't think you could teach spirituality, but he thought you could spark it so that it's like a positive contagion. And so he did all kinds of things. I mean, what back in the 30s, right? He had liturgical dance. He had poetry, he had music, and he also had live Madonnas.
What is that?
That's a woman holding a live baby under a particular light, and he would have people just sit and look at the woman holding the baby.
Really? Oh my goodness. Wow.
Yes.
Huh. Forget looking at a picture.
Yeah, no, not a picture.
Look at the real thing.
Yeah.
Wow.
With, with sort of costumes and everything.
That's creative. Very creative.
Oh, very creative. Or, he might have a dramatization of something. So he was just trying to spark, the presence in whatever way that might happen for someone. And he was pretty, innovative. The other thing was that he wrote many of these books of meditation, particularly Meditations of the Heart, For the Inward Journey, and Deep is the Hunger. He wrote those for times of silence in his congregation, particularly once he founded a church in San Francisco, the Church of the Fellowship of All People, co-founded a church, because he really wanted to know, can people from different backgrounds, worship the same God in one place? Because, in his time, things were very segregated.
Sure.
And we still have a lot of segregation in sort of religious worship. So, but he wanted to know if it was possible. So, but, people liked having a time before the worship service to like read a meditation and just sit in silence. And sometimes he would have a silent period during worship service. What's amazing is that he wrote that when he started doing that, requests for pastoral care went down. Because he was, when he was studying with Rufus Jones, who was an eminent Quaker mystic, he would go to unprogrammed Quaker meetings where, they would just sit in silence. And, he would every now and then have a transcendent experience where he would just lose himself into the greater whole, right? And that's where he started thinking about, the power of silence. And so he felt like, and wouldn't it be something if we could get congregations to be quiet for like 5 more minutes or more? I mean, Quakers do it, right? On a regular basis.
Yeah.
They even have children, I mean, you go to a Quaker school once a week, all the children from kindergarten up, sit for 30 minutes.
Man, I'd be a bad Quaker.
I think the world would be in a totally different place.
Yeah, I think you're right.
So, and he also had another form of what he called creative silence. I call it creative silence. I'm not sure if he called it that, but where you get a partner or a couple other people and you meet them in the silence once a week or once or twice a week. Mm-hmm. I'm doing that as a Lenten practice. So I have a partner who lives in a different part of the country, and we meet in the silence once a week. And we're just doing this as an experiment. I like to experiment myself. Doing it as an experiment, and we'll see how it goes. We'll talk after Easter and see what happens.
Well, there's a writer friend of mine who does that over Zoom with another writer. Basically they write together, but, separated physically.
See, in Thurman's time, there was no Zoom, right? So we're doing it old school.
Right.
Meet in the silence. And we're taking notes afterwards. Like I've already had taken some notes on, the experience.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll see how it unfolds.
So, I know you're kind of still in the midst of launching this, but are there any future projects or books that you can tell us about?
Well, birthing this baby. I'm still in it too, right? But I mean, the major labor is over. Obviously, the baby's out. But those first few weeks of care. So, I'm still doing a lot of book interviews, et cetera. And I don't know. I feel the Spirit calling me to a sabbatical, a kind of a quiet time. I don't know what's next. I know that I will probably go back to writing short essays, blogs, those kinds of things. And perhaps maybe somebody might want to publish those at some point, as a compilation. But I don't have book projects on the docket yet. And that's because I'm just waiting to hear what I'm supposed to be doing next. But I think there's some shifts. I think one of the things that's come up a few times is, I have a chapter on spiritual mentoring. Thurman was mentored by several people, and he mentored so many people. And so I've been hearing this call to perhaps maybe support and affirm more people into doing formal and informal spiritual mentoring. I think it's different from spiritual direction where you're meeting, once a month, on a regular kind of schedule, but just for people who may need some quiet counsel on a particular issue, but they don't necessarily feel like they need to be in spiritual direction. Not everybody needs to be in spiritual direction. There are a lot of people who need to be in spiritual direction who are not. Right? But I think there are those moments when we can use some spiritual support from someone who, as I say, has reached a certain level of spiritual maturity.
Mm-hmm.
And you see this in churches. There's usually an older person that some people may go to for, some spiritual advice, etc. And so I just think it would be good to explore that a bit more and just to see where the Spirit is calling me next. I feel like what this book has done for me is to help me shift a little bit into being more of a conduit for the Spirit and not necessarily making my own decisions about what I'm going to do next. Life is a little easier when you can surrender just a little bit and not be, I spent much of my adult life, setting goals and meeting goals and moving on to the next one before the one was done and, all that, right? A little crazy. And I think I'm in a different period of my life where I like being in the flow more than I do, paddling.
Certainly not paddling upstream, right?
That's right. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, Lerita, it's been so wonderful to speak with you about, this book and your work. And I love, all of the different, insights and wisdom that you just talked about here, much less, what's contained in that whole book. So that's a really an impressive work. And I'm really so glad for you. And thank you for bringing it to us and bringing it to the world.
Well, thank you for, having this interview and for exposing it to other people. I think that I am just so grateful for the people who have embraced it thus far. And, it was always my hope and dream that there would be something in that book that would touch whoever read it and would, give them an opportunity for transformation. So I'm hoping that, people will read it and it will, as Thurman would say, it will help them come alive, find that for themselves, and help them to start waiting and listening for, as he says, the sound of the genuine, which is another one of his, big lines. He's always trying to help us find our own selves, find out, sing your own song. I mean, he had all of those, follow the grain of your own wood. You don't have to be like anybody else. And so listen for your sacred call and go do that so that you can feel alive in the world and you can pass that on to other people.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Well, again, the title of the new book is What Makes You Come Alive? A Spiritual Walk with Howard Thurman. Please check it out at LeritaColemanBrown.com. Lerita, thanks again. It was wonderful to speak with you, and best wishes with the rest of this launch.
Well, thank you so much, Brian. I'm just delighted to be able to share this time of excitement with other people and you especially.
Oh, thank you.